has been a good friend and has spent a lot of time with us here in the college in the past 2 years. We were discussing the lecture schedule for this year, and somehow I had overcommitted us, and we had more guest lecturers than we had Mondays. And the faculty asked, well, where's Whitney Gordon? So I had to do some quick explaining and put Whitney Gordon on the schedule and take somebody else off. But he's here tonight, thank goodness. Whitney is probably the best known Ball Stater down in Columbus, Indiana. Part of his research was done down in Columbus. I found out the kind of research it was because I was talking to the head engineer for Cummins Diesel, Tom Harrison. He said, who's that wonderful guy from Ball State with the wonderful MG? And he said, what was he? And I said, well, he was a sociologist who was picking your brain about architecture in Columbus. So we've all looked forward to Whitney's remarks on Muncie. He says that when he got his doctorate from Purdue, he came over here to do some research on Middletown and has stayed here. I'm not sure whether that's the truth or not, but that's what he said. So I would, at this point, turn the meeting over to Dr. Whitney Gordon.
I thank you, Charles, for your kind remarks. It is true, I did come to collect data, and I did wind up staying. I don't know whether that's to my credit or to my discredit. You see, that's to me the outstanding issue there. And unfortunately, my remarks tonight are going to be confined pretty much to the subject of Muncie, because otherwise there would be simply too much material. Look, let me tell you what I started out to do and how it came about. The basic question, the root question I was interested in was, why do people in Muncie, this being Middletown, why do they build the kind of thing they do? It's really a very rudimentary question. Why are we building what we build in this city? Now, how then are you going to find out? There are many ways to do it. I chose a rather simple way, perhaps because I'm a rather simplistic methodologist, and that probably reflects a rather simple mind. But I thought, let's take this at a fairly journalistic level. Let's find people who can perhaps be of some assistance in answering the question. Therefore, I had to work out my sample of people whom I would interview. And my strength happens to be in focused interviews, so I focused interviewed. That is, I did what a journalist would do perhaps more casually. I did somewhat more rigorously and thoroughly. I also, of course, pulled in some hard data when I could pick it up with reasonable convenience and when it was germane. And then put it together and tried to come out with some kind of meaningful picture. Now, what you have to do, of course, is to probe. It isn't simply enough to ask a man who's built an office building, why did you build this building and why did you make these decisions? It's, of course, more to it than that. I think the one thing I better caution you against, and that is the idea that I was a neutral social scientist, wearing a white coat, of course, and cold-bloodedly looking at the world. No, I had a point of view, a rather passionate point of view. This, of course, has its strengths and its weaknesses. I think the strengths are, first of all, your research is going to have edge. It's going to have a little cut. Second, I think it's probably absolutely necessary because any research project that is worth anything, by the time you're through with it, you're so bored silly with it anyway, and so sick of it, that if you didn't have some passion when you began, you'll never finish it. Also, I'm of the view that if the question doesn't arouse some sense of inner academic and intellectual passion within the individual, probably the research isn't worth doing. So why bother? The danger, of course, I think is self-evident, and that is that one's research the findings will be seriously and profoundly biased by the passionate point of view. This is always a danger. It's more than a danger. It's an inbuilt ruination. It's not just a hazard. It's an actual factor. And one tries to compensate for it, and yet in the end I know it, influenced what I did and what I said. Though I will show you in a few minutes that I kept myself covered on that score and worked it out so it's heads I wins, tails they lose. This is very good in research when you can't lose. Now, let me make a couple of cautionary remarks about the research project. First of all, I used as a cutoff date May, I think it was, 1965. That is, I closed out the actual data collection then. It's now my suspicion that Muncie in May 1965 was just about at the lowest point it could reach in terms of architecture. Now, I know that's very, very low to boot. In fact, I don't know how we could have done much worse. We really were scraping bottom in terms of what was being done and what seemed to be done. There was only one direction to go, and of course that was up. I think actually things have begun to change. By the way, to this extent, Professor Sappenfield and I have had kind of a long-standing and pleasant disagreement. He has hope and thinks things are looking up. I am a liberal, and as any good liberal is, he's a pessimist, which is a delightful contradiction, but it's the way it is. I tell him he's already selling out and he's too young to do it. He doesn't like that thought. Look, though, on his side of the argument, what has transpired since '65? One very excellent church has been built. Now, it has its problems acoustically and otherwise, but basically I think it's quite a successful project. A second church may or may not also be rather good. At the time that I collected data, there wasn't one church that cut it architecturally. Second, there have been at least 4 small office buildings built that at least are not eyesores. And in Muncie, that's no small achievement. I'll be happy. Beyond that, one larger business establishment has been built that is, I suspect, quite good, and I say this as a novice in these matters, and that, of course, is the Boyce building downtown. 1 or 2 fairly good or adequate houses have been built that are, I think, considerably above the norm. I think perhaps vastly more important, of course, is the coming of the School of Architecture, and shortly, of course, your building. This is, I suspect, the most powerful, impressive element in the last 2.5 years. Now, this is indicative because it again reminds you the real action in Muncie isn't with the Bearcats, it's with Ball State. And that's very, very critical. Beyond that, I think, again, at a broader level, I'm reminded that Perkins and Will is now here rather than the kind of folk culture approach we had been using to campus planning. And I think this has been very, very fruitful. I think downtown, the coming of Victor Grew and Associates, it may be one of their more standard packages, but at least it beats putting up and taking down parking meters on Walnut Street. And I think this, again, considering where we've been, is a considerable achievement. Finally, I'm struck that attitudes seem to be changing among people. I have just 2 vignettes. I do not know whether they're representative, but of course I suspect they are. Sappenfield tells me recently that one of the businessmen, a younger businessman here, a big businessman, who one's first impression is that he's not a very sensitive fellow. He's kind of not sensitive. He stops Professor Sappenfield after a lunch downtown, one of the luncheon clubs, and says, "Now, Charles, when are you people going to start building some buildings that look like something out there," or something to that effect? Well, that he would be of this mind and this notice, of course, I think is interesting. Finally, and I think most impressive to me, because I had conversations with this administrator a few years ago and came away rather shaken. One of the administrators who did not strike me as very, very forward-thinking in matters of architecture is today one of the most turned on, alert, and committed people to good architecture at Ball State, and in particular the business of the School of Architecture. He's very excited and very much committed. So obviously people can change, things do change, and so it goes. Again, may I remind you that in my research I had it set up that I could see those aspects of building in Muncie that promised, well, let me put it this way, I should say. I was looking for those forces within the community that would encourage good architecture, and I have a list, you see, of potentially constructive forces. Then I had another list of impeding forces. Community, and by forces, I won't go into the technicalities of that definition, but pushes and pulls within the community that would impede good architecture, and I have a list on that. So again, you see why I'm saying I couldn't help but win. Whichever way Muncie goes in the next 10 years, I'll pull out the proper list, you see. You know, I'm always reminded of during the peak of the French Revolution, the reign of terror and virtue, there was one legislature in the revolutionary legislature when things were very tempestuous and very dangerous and the guillotine was being used somewhat frequently. He always went to the meetings of the legislature with a pocket, with a speech in one pocket for the radicals and the identical speech couched differently in the other pocket for the moderates. And depending on the mood of the assembly that day, he would whip out the right speech, and he survived the revolution when a lot of other people didn't. So, again, a methodological problem. I think I better mention a very fundamental limitation in this study, and that is I worked on the basis of given works of good architecture. That is, when I looked at good architecture, I was looking at specific buildings. That means implicitly, and I was aware of this, I was accepting the idea that one builds the house beautiful even in the city terrible and has done some good. In terms of the good society, in terms of a great society or a beautiful culture, this obviously is not adequate. It in no way cuts it. But considering Muncie and all and our various problems, I thought this was an appropriate frame, but please not an adequate one in any larger sense. Finally, I must remind you my data was confined to post-war building since World War II. For the social scientists here and for the architects involved in planning, let me caution you one thing. I'm reminded always of Alan Tempko's rather haunting remark when he said, "Florence has not always been a happy city." Good architecture, beautiful cities, and the good society are not necessarily correlated, quite obviously. One would like to wish and hope and think they are, and I think it's always very fine. But it is not a causal factor necessarily. It may be a contributory factor, but not a causal factor. All right. So I'm looking for forces that impede and forces that facilitate good architecture. This then led to a further problem, and one I'm sure you as architecture sensitive to. That is, what's good architecture? You know, minor issue. Well, of course, as a sociologist, I could pretend to play God, but such gods don't live long. Also, it would be absurd. No. I worked it out this way, and then you'll see what I had in mind. I had three sources for a preliminary list of potentially good architecture that could be potentially labeled good. I looked at every building in this town. And believe me, that takes some doing and is somewhat of a, kind of a crushing encounter. But I looked at every piece of construction in this city and beyond the city limits. And on a dreary day down on the south side, it is a very kind of crushing encounter. Then, and I put up my list of what I thought as a layman, and please, I am nothing but a layman in architectural matters, what I thought were buildings that had any possibility of being included in the list. Then I went to each of the four architects who were then practicing in this city, and I asked them to come up with a list. Then I would throw in my suggestions, which they hadn't included. And it was interesting. Sometimes they looked at me as if, well, where did you get that funny notion, Or all right. Finally, I went to two local artists, academic artists, aestheticians, and I asked them for their views. This biases the findings slightly. Notice these are artists. And good art and architecture are not synonymous terms, although in both cases, by the way, I picked aestheticians who are concerned in a general way with building. I loaded it in that direction. All right, from these preliminary lists, I then put together a final list of including any and every building which two or more of my judges, this meant really 6 judges because I put myself way down as just very uninfluential in this. I had 6 judges, and any building that had 2 votes was good architecture. That left me, by the way, with a total of 8 buildings. I have a feeling... that's the way it is. You tell it as is. I have a feeling, by the way, that there was not a very high consensus among our architects, aestheticians, and one lonely sociologist as to what amounts to good architecture in this town. By the way, among the 8, I think you'll be interested, I could find no pattern of rationales for what they had done. Now remember, this is 1965. One was a banking or a loan house, or whatever you want to call it, savings and loan company, which, by the way, was rather unanimously supported as good. 2 buildings were by a physician who had called in a nationally famous architect. His house and his little office, I still wonder why the office was included, except that it was by this man or by one of his draftsmen. It's always rather baffled me, but then again, I'm the layman. One residency built by a businessman who's a bit of a loner, kind of a lone dog. One house built by an architect for his own residency. One house built by a man whom I consider probably the most gifted of the builders in this town for his own residency, though he had moved from it. One local school, and one national corporation's factory that had been designed by their own people, of course. That was the final list. Now, you may quarrel, you may wonder what school ever so rated, or why 2 other schools weren't included. Well, that's a matter of your professional competency and judgment, and I have to beg out. What I think you'll notice is that I had come up with an operational definition. That is, good architecture, for the purposes of this study, is what architects call good architecture. That's all. And I had pretty much stayed out, which I think was absolutely essential. Now, then I came and turned to the business of the interviewing. Now, who am I going to interview? Well, here's the way I did it with my focused interview. Of course, I interviewed the 4 local architects. Later, I'll read you some of their remarks, and you may then want to go into sociology. Then I can read you what sociologists say about their field, and you'll come right back here. I interviewed the clients or their representatives for the 8 good buildings, for the 8 good objects of architecture. I interviewed who was ever closest to it. In the case of the doctor, he's dead. I had to do the best I could. But I interviewed those people, and they are particularly pursued. Why and how did you step out of the norm and do what you did, and so forth and so on, and what problems were there? Beyond that, at that time, there were listed 35 realtors in this town. I took a statistically random sample of 3 of them and interviewed them. Then I took 3 more who were commended to me by other informants as men or women, whichever the case was. These were, I must recall, all men, who were peculiarly well qualified to discuss such matters. I did the same thing with the builders. There we have an N of 54, that is a population of 54 builders. And by the way, the builders and the realtors overlap horrendously. And I took a statistically random sample of 3, and then I drew 5 more, 3 of whom had been recommended because of their general competency and knowledgeability, and 2 specifically because they had delved into non-speculative building. They had done some non-speculative work. They were what I would call the 2 creative builders in the city. Beyond that, I took the senior loan officers from both the savings and loan companies, and by the way, they handle 75% of the loans that are being made, so obviously this was very important and influential. The banks don't do much, but just to be on the safe side, I interviewed a bank official from one of the 3 banks. I chose that at random. And finally, I interviewed the public school officials, including school board members and university personnel. Oh, one more group. I took clergy from the 2 most substantial churches that have been built here since the war and interviewed them. All right, there's the background of the study. That's, in effect, how I set it up. Now, what did I find? Let me take it by categories of building, kind of crude categories and concerns, and talk about building for the commercial client. Well, what do we find here? Here in this, and this is the last really rather technical point I'm going to be giving you, and then I will treat you to something a little less formidable. I took 4 sample areas from the city, sample areas that were loaded in terms of post-war building and in part loaded towards affluence. I wanted to kind of weight things in favor of whatever was the best. knowing that it was going to be grubby anyway, and that I could beat them over the head with my findings, I thought, well, let's give them a break. So what I took was the budding shopping center was then budding. It's now turning into typical suburban sprawl and mess down at Jackson and Tillotson, down there by the now 3 gas stations, Dalby's, yes, and Rotes, and the Lincoln Mercury, and the Brazier Burger, and that sort of thing. Then I took the village over here, right off campus. Then I took 1.3 miles of highway culture. That's what we call it in sociology. It's a good term. Actually, that was Upper Broadway, out there on Upper Broadway, at the edge of the park where there's a Shell station and the park and what else there. From there on up north for 1.3 miles. And finally, I took 56 city blocks downtown, bounded by the river, by the tracks, by Madison, and I think it was Liberty or something. I'm a little hazy there. All right. On those, I then broke it down into categories of building. And again, I operationalized my definitions, thinking this might be kind of sound. Minimal cost. What was typical of minimal cost? Let me just give you an example of the criteria I used. Cinder brick, 1 room, flat roof, maybe a little dressing up, as they call it, on the front. In short, pretty grim. Just a 1 room, just a box, cinder brick box with a door cut in front, maybe a window. Again, you can study the data for yourself and see where it was being built and what its ratio. You can read down and across to your margins. Then I took the category of stock designs. Typical example, of course, would be national gasoline station buildings. And again, of course, you're not surprised that this appears here very much on highway culture. Then I took architecture, and I put it in quotes, which meant just about anything, anything and everything that might have had an architect, such as the rather forbidding telephone company building downtown. I had to count that architecture, though I think someone might lose his AIA license for it. But my last category, I found I did have to have one more category, one I simply call residual, typical of the residual category. Semi-mass-produced house. Obviously, it was, a Halteman Village type house or something, or Bartell, and it had been built for and employed as, let's say, an insurance agency building. Oh, I'm sorry. Kill the gems of wisdom. Been converted to a insurance building. Well, what are you going to do with this? I had residual. Again, I think you find your marginals rather provocative. For instance, at most, 10% is banking, most of it downtown. Minimum cost and residual makes, if you work it out in percentage terms, 63%. Pretty fantastic, pretty unbelievable. I'm sorry I can't elevate that for you. Now, I asked, of course, why these buildings were what they were. That is, I asked the builders and the others, why were the decisions what they were? On 4 points, my informants were almost totally unanimous. For instance, they said, first and of course foremost, money. Filthy old money. Minimum cost. I think that's quite evident when you think about this. A second point, and one I had not thought of, and I hope you as architects do think of, but it did slip my imagination completely. They wanted quick completion. They want early occupancy. This is very, very important. And this is stressed by the clients to the builders who build the commercial buildings. Third, they do want a functional layout, functional in the sense that they want to be able to carry on their trade or their work and their sales and display, if it is a sales place. That they want to be able to do with reasonable efficiency. Finally, and last on their priorities, and again, here I had very high consensus among my informants, was the fact that if there's a little money left over, and if it won't cost too much, and these were always stipulated, they want to, quote, dress it up a bit, unquote. Yeah, a little cosmetic on the front. This means extruded aluminum picture window. If you're lucky, it's going to be thermopane. And maybe a little tile on the front instead of the cinder brick and something of that sort. But it's dressing it up, and that's about all. So very, very, very. Now, there were three other points, less frequently noted, but I think revealing. Some of the builders did complain, particularly what struck me as the more sensitive builders, that there were very few opportunities here for good or favorable siting. How do you site a building in Muncie? Well, that's a thought. A second point was that we lack today, with the passing of the Ball Corporation, in the traditional sense, the passing of it, we lack any large, locally based company which might want to build its image and mark its image with an effective or at least an impressive kind of construction. And I thought that was an interesting argument. Finally, an economist here made a very interesting observation. He, I think, is quite well qualified to make the remark. He said, look, we've had a loss of social capital. Social capital. The Ball family, as the Linds pointed out in their second volume, were like the great oak tree. It shaded the community, but not much grew up under it. And when the Ball family, that is the first generation, left the scene, and the second generation, with only several exceptions, pretty much disengaged itself from Muncie, it left us with pretty scrubby grass in terms of social capital. And until new social capital evolves, and I think it is evolving, I think this is quite evident, we probably are going to lack leadership. I thought this was a rather shrewd observation, one which, of course, one would have to check out much more closely, but it's just a hunch. Well, there's your picture, very, very briefly, on commercial. Let me turn and talk about the public schools. If you've decided you're not going to go into commercial work in Muncie, let me suggest the public schools. Well, here, of course, I talk to the school board people. And one thing you run into again and again, rather standard remark, is that there are two things that are first and foremost when it comes to finding an architect for school. First, as one of the school board members put it, a senior member, he said, we want to know if the architect is on the level. Which I guess means you better not be shifty-eyed and have long sideburns, and certainly no beads and bells and sandals. You're dead. You've got to be on the level. Someone you can trust, somebody who, by the way, this seems to me also to suggest that apparently you people as professional architects aren't very well trusted, you know. Are you horse traders, or what are you people? Or is it the paranoia of school boards? I don't know. The second point was they want a flexible and cooperative architect. That troubles me. I just don't know what it implied. I knew what he seemed to have in mind, but I wonder how architects react to that statement. But I simply give it to you for what it is. Very, very central in the thinking of your school board is the business of costing. Again, money is writ very, very large. They say, look, we have finite resources and we have infinite needs. I think equally important, and they were rather frank about this, is, of course, the low tax rate ideology, which, by the way, these men share, a low tax rate ideology. Well, this means that the charge of fat hung about the collective neck of the school board can be utterly disastrous. That is the albatross that outsmells all albatrosses. Never be accused of having fat in the school budget. Somehow, Columbus, of course, has survived this. Well, this means some rather frankly accepted consequences, and what struck me was that these people were so frank. Particularly as one school board member, was very frank about the consequences of this. He said, look, this means we don't want buildings with wood on the interior. Stained wood is too hard to maintain. I thought plaintively of Warnicke's work down at Columbus. He said, look, if it means tile halfway up the wall like at Southside, that's what we'll have. I thought, yeah, just like a prison, halfway up the side. And they're frank about it. That doesn't trouble them. Buildings will be rectangular. Minimum of outside wall space, minimal inside corridors. And it goes on and on. By the way, they did make a couple of good points. They said, look, our Hoosier climate is treacherous because it is so variable, both in humidity and temperature, as some of you may have discovered recently. It is very treacherous, and they've had some bitter experience with structural problems. Therefore, they want no more flat roofs. They want to avoid valleys whenever possible. Well, of course, again, this hems the architect in and sends him propelling out to California, I guess. I think, though, to get the flavor of this was the conclusion of an interview with a senior school board member who, as he shook my hand over his desk, and under the glass top of his desk was a map showing in bright, livid kind of how would you call it, strawberry pink, all the areas the communists were taking over, and that kind of troubled me, you know. I had a feeling he and I were, we didn't quite understand the same kind of political perspective. But he said to me, as he shook my hand and looked me straight in the eye, that dead dick straight in the eye kind of thing, he said, the school plants all look good to me as long as they function good. I thought, well, actually that is a rendition of form follows function, but one in which both the grammar and the application leaves me somewhat uneasy. Well, then I came back out to campus, and now I am, of course, telling tales out of school, I guess, but that's the way it is in research. I think what goes on at the university is of singular importance, I think for two reasons. First, this is where the action is. This is where the growth is. For that reason alone, what we do is of monumental importance. Secondly, the prestige that accrues to this university in the community and in the neighboring rural areas and small towns is so great that anything we do looms doubly large if they get around to looking at it. Therefore, I think our role is very, very singular. By the way, among my informants, almost without exception, now this bars some university people, faculty and administration both, generally the architects and the artists and the others all agreed that the work done out here to date, that is as of mid-1965, is, well, between dreary and unspeakably bad. By the way, I am advised, though, structurally it's quite good, even if you can't get up and down the stairwells at the change of class time. Those stairwells aren't going to fall down and they aren't going to leak. Well, that's good. In fact, I have coined the phrase that, we used to growl about Stalinist socialist realism, that which, by the way, has virtually passed outside of Albania, which, all right, it's Albania. But socialist realism, ghastly social, well, we have our answer. Of course, we will never let communism get ahead of us. We have capitalist realism. And capitalist realism is Bald State. And somehow I wish there were a third power somewhere where I could go and hide, maybe Copenhagen or someplace. Well, let me give you a couple of quotes from people who felt unkindly about what we have done, and then let me give you the defense. One gentleman said, those carousel-like entranceways on the new dormitory at Studebaker East. My God. It wasn't true. It wasn't true. He said, the elephantine lightness of it all. Elephantine lightness. A local architect made the remark, and by the way, I will in no time identify individuals, though you might dearly wish I would. A local architect said to me, rather jabbing his finger across his desk at me, Ball State is a center of culture. And it's a center in this area. And look! Why so crude? I just sat there and said, well, let me give you the administration answer. One high administrator gave his answer, and I took it down straight-faced, and I think, though, you better be prepared to confront it. He said, oh, sure, some of the art department particularly is sore at S's, of the architectural firm. They claim that S's lacks imagination, and they do not like the insistence upon continuity. People make fun of the architecture, the lack of imagination. Yes, but there are only so many dollars. Criticisms are met when we can, and I think we have profited from them when they aren't unreasonable when it comes to costs. Now, look at Clues. Clues seats 2,400 versus 3,600 at our new auditorium, and ours cost about one-half as much. Imagination costs money. Then I think I must have not hidden my startle response, because he said, well, not always. And then he said, and then we ask our critics, what would you do? By the way, this is one of the gentlemen who today so strongly supports the new School of Architecture. And I think this, again, is what impresses me. By the way, he went on to note, quite rightly, that a simple precast concrete cornice for the rim of a dormitory roof can cost you a cool $12,000. And he said, as I recall, he said, that's blowing a lot of money for a little decoration. Well, again, you argue that among yourself. You're the architects. I'm the sociologist. By the way, he did not comment on something that I have wondered about. All right, we talk about this kind of unnecessary expenditure and the tight budget, but we seem always to be determined to put this cosmetic facade of brickwork on reinforced concrete high-rise buildings as if they're really held up by the bricks. I suspect that costs a good deal of money. I don't know, but I suspect masonry is not cheap these days, from what I've heard. By the way, whatever the arguments, and this is a very long discussion, whatever the arguments there concerning the campus building, I still wonder if the elephantine carousels as detailing are really necessary. But again, I think I better leave that out to you. I think if I were to raise a fundamental question about the university, at least as of 1965, it would be the rather actually unkind thought that, look, we have tried very hard to work with the community, and of course the legislature is significant. We have rather frankly, as of 1965, reflected the general ethos of the society. But Ball State happens to be an institutional symbol of both community excellence and of leadership. So what I think we've actually done, ironically, is we have reaffirmed, by cooperating, we have reaffirmed that caliber of mind and that climate of opinion which we're actually dedicated to elevating. And I wonder if we don't have a problem here. We have to someday sort out. Well, all right, so you've given up on all public educational, university architecture. How about doing some church work? You know, you have a little more elbow room there. Well, I talked about the churches. 41 churches have been built in Muncie since World War II. And here, by the way, to my surprise, I ran into something of a very real shock. There was a hidden joker there in that part of my research that I had not anticipated and which shook me rather deeply. But I'll hold that for a moment. 5 substantial churches have been built since the war, none of which came anywhere near being on anybody's list for good architecture. By the way, I checked this out a little bit. The 2 most significant churches built as of 65, both can only be called art petard. I'm sorry, there's no other proper description. I wondered if the theology was also a petard theology, but thought I better not ask. And I cause enough trouble as is, you know. Well, how did this happen? It wasn't because the architects were heathens or monsters, no. They had simply made Solomon's judgments when confronted with congregational divisions. In one case that is peculiarly dramatic, half the congregation wanted colonial, which, by the way, the architects spoke of rather bitterly as pseudo-colonial, and the bitterest of the 2 architects, 2 of them, call it psycho-colonial. All right, they wanted pseudo-colonial, but some of the congregation wanted what they call modern, whatever that is. So, the Solomon's judgment, the exterior is pseudo-colonial, the interior is modern. Bingo. Everybody's happy or nobody's happy. But that isn't really where the data caught me. It was the other churches, the other 36 churches, and I looked at every one. They are really pitiful things, most of them, truly pitiful. It was very humbling. These are poor churches, pitifully poor churches. They're built by the poor with their own hands, and they're built for the institutional Christianity of the poor. And I hope they find some spiritual gratification, because all I felt was somehow crushed as a human being. Architecture that could, well, I wouldn't call it even that. Poor skills, terribly poor skills often, terribly poor materials, often discarded materials or shoddy materials, poorly put together. And I wondered then at the end if there was another element, but this I never checked out, but it's a hypothesis someone should chase down. Was the barrenness and the sadness and the dreariness, was it also a function of a religious or ideology which repudiates the things of this world and yet must have a meeting house? I think this is something one wants to think about with some sympathy. Well, all right, if I have ruined you there, how about the residential client? Who builds what for the residential client? Well, I can tell you the answer in short is that in Muncie, over 99.5% is built by the mass or semi-mass builder. Very little architect built. Now, I then pursued this and said, well, why aren't architects building houses in Muncie to any extent? One man was doing work at that time, and I think very promising. Well, first, the scarcity of architects. 4 architects in a city of then about 74,000. They were absolutely covered up, most of them, with commercial work. The bigger firm was certainly covered up with commercial work. Secondly, we find that the public presumes that architects aren't needed, unless it's really a big job. And the general figure I kept coming back to was something in excess of $30,000. If it isn't a more than $30,000 house, you don't need an architect. That's the public attitude. And even then, the complaint was, and the complaint among the architects and the pride among the builders, well, even then the architect isn't really very much needed, except for some decoration. Again, which of course makes the architect go crawling up the wall, I guess. Third, and rather shocking, but I'm sure you're familiar with it, the public presumes that architects are economic idiots. And more on that, you're loony visionaries. I think the visions of Frank Lloyd Wright have never got out of their mind. By the way, no one seemed to entertain the suggestion that the architect might recoup the client the architectural fee costs through economic design and adroit use of materials, to say nothing of habitability and some kind of spiritual gratification, if you want to call it that. A very interesting point also raised, why architects aren't being employed for residential work, is that the average client, particularly the ordinary middle-class client, is rather afraid of being bulldozed, of being somehow overwhelmed. Look, you're architects. You have an esoteric vocabulary, you have an esoteric body of knowledge, and you might ask the client questions he can't answer. You'll humiliate him. Consequently, he avoids the whole encounter and finds a package deal. And the package deal is very, very attractive. I wonder if, to this extent, you as architects haven't missed or are missing a very real opportunity to go out and meet the Joneses, so to speak, and meet them on their level, and then bring them into the nest of your work. I wonder if there isn't also a social psychological problem, and here perhaps I'm stepping on a few toes, and understand I do so without any antagonism. And that is, are you people so committed to wearing the image, the costume, and playing the role of the professional architect, which is a rather high status occupation, of course, that you're so well coated up? And believe me, I support this. I just wrote Dean Sappenfeld a long memorandum on how I thought, you people could encourage the students to becoming professional. But I wonder if there isn't a negative side of this. You become so professional, you put a wall, a barrier, between you and potential clients, which means also you're putting a barrier between you and your money. And I wonder if you shouldn't think about this and play with it somehow. One thing surprised me very much. All the builders agreed, and realtors, and I had missed this and I shouldn't have, and that is the house magazines have a tremendous impact upon the market of residential, particularly if the designs are not too extreme in conception and not too extremely expensive. This is a tremendous push. Now, the builders to some extent like this. For one thing, the house magazines have that feeling of, let's all go out and build, that's fine, don't worry about that. Also, they're rather appreciative of the sound advice the magazines give the client, such as how to handle financing, how to go about this, site picking, and so forth and so on. They're ambivalent, though, on another score, and that is the house magazines, of course, are a fashion magazine, and therefore styles change erratically and rapidly, and they say you run like mad just to keep up with this year's fashion, and they find that rather annoying. I asked the builders what seem to be the determinants of residential choices. By the way, I thought I had winnowed this thing really down, but I see it's going to run a little over an hour. If you find it painful, just tiptoe out. I'll glare at you, but won't say anything. Sorry. We'll get finished, don't worry. Now, I asked them, well, what seemed to determine the choices, the kinds of choices people make? Let me read you some of the statements from the builders, and I biased the comments, biased it in the direction of the creative builders and the more what struck me as insightful builders. Here are the kinds of remarks I got, and they might serve you at some point. One of the most sensitive builders said, the local elite are plain folks. They're unpretentious, and they're negative toward the egotism of high style. There's one exception, and that's the H house, and it's derided. Another man says, my buyers are inspirational buyers. They buy what they see that they like. They want something pleasant. Another one says, here there are so very few examples of good work. They have nothing here to show them. Here again, I think, is where you people can have a profound influence. Another man, I believe this actually was an architect, made the remark, status anxiety is a real factor here, and people who live in progressive houses are independent people, and this is a very cliquish town. Another builder, it is upsetting. The clients see price tag values rather than artistic or architectural values. For example, they see a $100,000 house and they go, gee whiz. It's true, I've seen it happen. Another man says, building is big money, and the economically conservative people aren't going to risk the oddball. The tried and the proven, not the adventuresome. They play it safe if big money is involved. Another man, look, if it's a man's biggest investment, he wants to be sure it's saleable. And in a mobile society, this is a real issue. For example, companies who promise to sell a house for an executive, they say, build what you want, but 1, think of the community, and 2, remember marketability. Another man says, clients tie when you come up with genuinely original work. I avoid it. There is nil demand for contemporary, and it takes me time to build, and it costs a lot of money. Another man says, clients aren't hungry for good architecture or for good construction. If I give them 1 extra room for the kids, it's worth a lot of green wood to them. That'd crush a man. Another man says, even the lower class wants deluxe utilities. Comforts and convenience items really eat into my building budget. Okay, I think you're getting the flavor. Let me warn you, as unhappy as you may be, Kennedy's research and Rossau's research both indicate that the public, generally, the middle-class suburban public, is not dissatisfied with the ticky-tacky they're getting. That's one of the brute facts of existence. By the way, I think this comes home with a kind of sickening thud when you think of what is happening to the Reston experiment. I think there's very, very meaningful, and I think it's something we have to think about and face up to and not just condemn the public. All right, how about the speculative builder as a person? I think this was one of the most shocking things to me. It is he who really faces or defaces the land more than anyone else in Muncie. So what kind of man is he? Well, you listen to him and you understand a little more. Here is one of the most successful builders in Muncie. He says, I'm a pragmatist and a builder, and I read a lot. I'm no AIA man, and then he spit out the door of his pickup truck. I am no AIA man or engineer, but I sure am a licensed plumber. And every once in a while I go up to Purdue and make sure about structures and developments. Another man says, my wife designs all my houses, and I think she does a real good job. We make them livable. That's what people want, and we have been successful. She uses 1/4-inch grid paper and a lot of horse sense and a lot of experience. By the way, in terms of floor plans, that guy's houses are pretty good. In any other sense, they look to me like camp pancakes feel, you know, just kind of, ugh. But there are actually some of the better houses being built here. Another man says, yes, I like those bolt-on shutters, and so do the people who buy from us. They really dress a place up. Yep, they're nice. What do they say about you guys, you architects? Well, here's a very typical remark I got from the builders when I asked them, well, how about the architects? Ah, hell, the architects go out in left field. They're too damn visionary, and they're not practical, and too expensive as a result. Let me show you a typical case, and he was pointing at this house we were driving by. He said, this architect specifies an off-size lumber for those decoration slats. That means special milling and waste, and that costs a client an awful lot of money these days. By specifying lumber just 1/2 inch narrower, he could have saved them hundreds of dollars just like that. Okay, now there I think you have a point. Again, people have to wrestle with. Finally, by the way, the builders argue quite frankly that they're not in business to be le patron or something like that. No, they're not in it for their health very directly. No, they're in it to make money. Finally, they always come back to me, you know, when I needle them a little and say, look, buddy, the proof is in the pudding. They buy. Okay, Say that. They also note, by the way, that the speculative market is very strong in Muncie. Therefore, of course, conventional houses are very, very likely. They also note an increase in the pattern of trade-ins, such as we have with Detroit automobiles. Well, this, of course, again, has certain Detroitish kinds of implications in the kinds of houses people are going to build. I asked about workmanship as such, and here's a typical example. A man says, look, W's experience is instructive. You can get good building done here, but it costs like hell. The crews just are not familiar with construction techniques. Therefore, you are repeatedly tempted to resort to the traditional, well, at least now traditional. And so you use old designs and old techniques. Okay. I think two final quotes really give the bite. But one, of course, is you'll note an inadvertent parody on Le Corbusier. The guy says, a building is a machine to make money with. But he meant it, he's very frank. I admired him, he's a building machine to make money with. And another one, really, took the cake. He looked at me and he smiled and he looked up and he said, we cater to finicky females, the heartbeat of the nation. What do you expect then in your house, And I'm reminded that one of the artists said, when I was interviewing, he said, Babbitt is dead, Babbitry lives. I think, though, there's a more serious aspect and one where you people come into it perhaps in a helpful way. I think what we're getting is a vicious circle effect to a great extent. Ticky-tacky is built in great, great numbers, and ticky-tacky becomes then the norm of what housing should be, can be, and is, reinforcing the tendency, of course, to build ticky-tacky, beyond all the economic issues, which, of course, loom very large in mass housing. Here, again, I think the School of Architecture can begin to break this kind of circular effect. Well, I asked after such things as realty, zoning, various ordinances, and, of course, the lenders. Let me handle that very briefly. Louis Mumford, writing in 1924, was dead right. Just dead right. He said, the use of land in America is nakedly speculative. And that's about what it is. And then if you on top of it, we have very few felicitous sites, so it's pretty bad. How about zoning ordinances? Well, I found they have two main functions. One is to be made variances of. There's no question about it. Our zoning is simply a guideline so you know where to deviate. It kind of keeps you on course when you're going off course. Secondly, and I was a little shocked by this, and it shows my political naivete when the nitty-gritty of local politics in any normal city, the zoning ordinances are used to bottle up unseemly economic competition. This has happened more than once. I checked it out in a couple of cases pretty closely, knowing this is the kind of thing that becomes rumor mongering. They bottle up things. How about the lenders? Well, of course, as you know, the lenders are often seen as the villain of the piece. They're somewhere behind the scenes, and they're mighty, and they're mightily conservative. Well, as a matter of fact, they're not. They used to be. But by all accounts, that now has broken down. For one thing, they've simply loosened up. A second point, those who wouldn't loosen up quietly went into retirement. One of the reasons they loosened up was that a man can always get money from out of town. He can always go down to Indianapolis or up to Chicago or Detroit or to Columbus and get some money. So there's no problem there. Now, the lenders do rightfully note that unusual architecture is hard to move on the resale market. And even though they insure their loans and all that, still they get a little uneasy. And so what they will occasionally do is instead of accepting 10% down, and by the way, they're very troubled by that thought anyway as a man of finance, they will demand 15 or 20% down if it's really a, quote, as one of the men at one of the companies said, an oddball project. And he kind of looked at me with that dead guy again, now. You know what I mean, don't you? Now, he's dead right. He's dead right. One piece of research I ran into indicates that only about 3% of your residential clients want contemporary work. And by the way, that 3% is a rather interesting population when you look at them sociologically. They're made up of two subgroups. Either they're upper middle class urban Jews, or they're affluent academes. The point being, if you want to do contemporary architecture, you find yourself a prosperous Jewish academe, and man, you've got it. You made it, you know. How about the architects? How about our 4 architects and our 2 gifted builders? I titled this section of the paper, The Architect's Travail. Their morale was not good in 1965. Particularly, they were griping about the psycho-colonial. I think anything I could say would be less adequate than what they said. Let me read you a few of their remarks. Here's, just call him Architect A. I came to a small city with the explicit hope that there I could be able to show my stuff. I did not want to be buried in a huge firm the way some of my friends have been. But there is really no freedom here to be creative. Hell, there's virtually no demand for it. Boom. Here there is little professional respect in the community. The architect is usually on the defensive. Bad work does not scuttle firms here. It's not talent that lands commissions, it's contacts. Very interesting. By the way, again, I think the professional respect, you people are having a very real impact. And one man said, he pointed the flower, a little, I think it was a daisy or something, in a little vase in his desk, and he said, "Why is the flower beautiful? There is where you have to start with my clients." And the big commissions, well, they go out of town directly. Architect B says, architectural school utterly fails to prepare you for the psychological battle and conning of the client which is called for. I trust you're getting some group psychology training here, or clinical techniques or something, or just straight intimidation from the black Muslims or something. 90% of the battle is to educate the public. But maybe things are getting better. And you know, once in a while, you can bully a client who is determined to make a mess of things. I love that man's sense of humor. Right? That's very good. He also made another remark. There's no point being bitter. I do find clients a challenge and an education. But there are terrible dangers. A man wants commissions in order to build a name for himself. But if they vulgarize your conception, it is your reputation which is ruined. And on the other hand, if you start walking off jobs, you are also going to be in very, very serious trouble. It's very sound, very true. By the way, this poor gentleman was obliged, we'll try to conceal it very effectively, to build a building that was really a monstrosity. It was a fabulous commission, but it was a monstrosity. And my wife and I have a term for it, which I can't use, because it would immediately, you'd know where it is and what it is, and you'd all chuckle. But I think he felt he was on the cross when he did that building, and he survived it, and now, as I understand, doing quite well. He also said, how do you think people feel when they know that commissions are thrown your way as throwing crumbs? Architect C, if I'm bitter, it is not about architecture here, but about the politics that surround it. I think we all get terribly discouraged at times. Then he went on, after a while you get worn down by things. If you are not very careful, an attitude of make 'em happy comes to dominate your own work. The city's most gifted builder made a very searching remark. He said, oh, I have built a fair number of houses here, and I have done a few other things as well. But if you ask me how many really good clients I have had, I would have to say that while many have been very nice people, only 2 have been really good clients. He, by the way, implied that he was one of the clients when he built his own house. He didn't say so, but that was the implication. Now, all right, that finishes the formal data. I want to draw 1 or 2 broader conclusions. I've given you the negative factors. I will not repeat them. It's getting late. There are 14 at least, and that certainly will be a good argument. If we never do another decent thing in this town, we've got a case here. But also, we have to explain the good things. I think there are at least 3 or 4 factors that may support the coming of good architecture to Muncie. First, you'd always have the discriminating loner, the businessman who's a marginal man and doesn't worry about what the crowd thinks. The affluent academe, there'll be more of a thing as salaries go up, who may be on occasion inclined to do something unusual. That sort of thing. I think a second and much more important factor, of course, is, again, the arrival of this school of architecture. I think you're terribly important. Thirdly, I think there is a growing public awareness of architecture as such. The public is becoming more aware of architecture. Even if they then turn up Miami moderns half the time, still there's an awareness. Now, this I then am arguing that there is a general cultural leavening. And this is coupled with affluence and leisure and generally the prosperity of America. And I think this also ties in with the Kennedy administration in Washington. Mr. Kennedy certainly, though a lot of it's got washed down the drain somewhere in the Dardanelles, Mr. Kennedy talked very passionately about the quality of American life as well as the quantity of American life. And I think there will always be a rub-off effect from this. I think there's been a permanent kind of contribution. If there is doubt in all of this in my mind, it is that I wonder, quite honestly and frankly, if by the end of the coming summer, if any of us will have much heart to talk about good architecture. I'm sorry, I can see all this, that it'll almost be kind of an obscenity to worry about beauty at the end of the summer. I hope I'm wrong, but I'm not confident. Fortunately, the predictive prowess of sociology is notoriously poor, and there's a good chance I'm wrong. But I do not see a happy time through the summer months in this country, and one wonders what that then larger cultural impact will be on the arts and the quasi-arts. By the way, there is always, of course, the mixed role of the house magazines. Now, the last thing I want to turn to is the business of a footnote concerning political and ideological aspects of architecture and building. We live in, again, what has become a rather political epoch, and I think one ought to think of this. What I have in mind is that the left, the hard left, the Marxist left, has always insisted that the kinds of things, bad architecture, let's say in Muncie, is a function of the short-range self-interest motives, that are inherent, notice the term inherent, in the capitalistic economic order. My own data, though one never has direct data on this kind of sweeping indictment, my own data does lend a good deal of support to this thesis. There's no use squirming. The fact is that short-range self-interest is perhaps responsible for a great deal of God's own junkyard, as Peter Blake called it. Though I'm unhappy, I do not think this is a sufficient explanation. Well, let me say it is a sufficient and it's an adequate explanation, but it is not a necessary explanation. For instance, think again back at the days of Stalinist Russia and the Eastern satellites, or think of Red China since 1949. China has perhaps one of the most lofty and complex traditions in architecture that one could imagine. And what do you have today? You have in China barracks socialism, by the way, a term that Marx himself used and spoke of with great detestation, barracks socialism. And that's exactly what you have. You've seen in pictures of what's been put up in China today, most of it is dreary in the extreme and reflects a barracks kind of socialism. So I think communism of that sort, collectivism, can do just as bad a job as we can do. They do it slightly differently. On the other hand, the extreme right has taken an opposite position. I think of Ortega y Gasset, and more recently, and at a much more vulgar level, someone such as Ayn Rand. And here they have said that to have good architecture, you must have the unfettered individualist, almost a kind of Nietzschean individualist. And that as long as you have mass society, whatever we mean by that rather slippery term, you're going to stifle great architecture. Well, they cite by way of examples, and I think their case again is shockingly well made, such things as the Medici-like role of the Miller family, particularly Miller himself, in Columbus. Columbus is what it is because of Miller. Now, there's now beginning to be a little bit of a rub-off effect on others, but it's basically Miller. I think, though, this kind of argument is bound to fail in America for several reasons. First of all, rampant individualism, the great individualist, first of all, again, allows the small fry to make God's own junkyard. And for the big fry, for every Berenson you have, or every Rockefeller, you have at least 2 Mad Ludwigs and 3 Randolph Hearsts. So I don't know that that's the answer. I even have a more fundamental argument there. I think we are a society that has egalitarian commitments. These, of course, at points interfere with the ideal of excellence. I think we will never and have never reconciled the idea of egalitarianism and the ideal of excellence. We like to think we have, but I don't think we have. But as long as the ideal of egalitarianism is writ large in American culture, I think the siren songs of the elitist right, and it is an elitist ideology, is bound to fail. The many will always pull it down, always check it, always become suspicious and uneasy and try to undercut it one way or another. And in one sense, I'm obviously saying, I think rightfully so. Well, if I find the right and the left both partially right and partially wrong, what is my own partially right, partially wrong view? Actually, I think if you ask, why is the mess that is America, and in this case the mess that is Muncie, why? I think it comes down to a more cultural, logical kind of issue. That is, I'm talking about culture. I think the brute fact is that despite a slow awakening, started perhaps with the Kennedy years, most Muncie'ites, when you get right down to the nitty-gritty, most Muncie'ites simply do not put a high premium on what architects call good architecture. And again, in closing, I'm reminded of Mumford, writing 44 years ago. That old boy had it. He was then a young man. He said at the end of his Sticks and Stones, architecture, like government, is about as good as a community deserves. Well, I'm sorry to leave you on a doleful note, but I hope it means your work is cut out for you and you can see what you have to do. Well, I thank you for your very great patience because I've run over.
Dr. Gordon says he will answer some questions if you have any to put to him.
This again, I have a feeling that there's a subtle grain, I should tell you, of edge between Dean Sappenfeld and myself. I think it's a very friendly edge, but there's always the edge, and I think this is his opportunity, his great chance to, you know. Yes, sir.
What do you think that the architects can do to overcome some of these problems that are coming up with people's diet and so forth?
My first reaction is buy a six-pack of beer, but no, that's a defeatist attitude, though, of course, today would be pot anyway, so, no, I think what you can do, the very fact you're here, the very fact you're going out in the field, the very fact, though, of course, it's an uphill fight for you, either get swallowed up in a big firm, or you run into clients who simply want you to put their signature to their warehouse that's, you know, a prefab job or whatever. I think you're getting your foot in the door. I think through a number of strategies, you will be part of the leavening influence. And I see a circular kind of impact. If it can be circularly reinforcing that we build ticky-tacky, I think it can be circularly reinforcing that we do something a little better. And I think you're going to have a progressively sympathetic public. Now, I know I'm putting the sugar coating on this pretty heavily. I'd say go back through the various aspects of the talk as you think about it, and such things as offering the public maybe a package deal, even if it hurts your professional pride. Learning a little bit about the finance and this sort of thing, so you can, like the builder, you can say, well, we'll design what you want and everything will be sewed up. Even the evergreens will be planted around the base in the dull, normal tradition. You know, give them the whole ball of wax, so to speak. I would think this is just a little gimmick. Now, that's just a gimmick, of course, but I think it might help. That, I think they're in a number of areas. Yes, sir.
You mentioned this wall that you thought was between the architect and the public. How do you think this wall came about?
Obviously, I think, sir, and I don't know how well you receive this as a group, and I'm happy to entertain contradictions. In your understandable desire to be marked off as a profession and to maintain the dignity of a truly prestigious profession, you have worn your handsome coat, your professional coat, that marks your role in such a way that the public is awed. Maybe they ought to find out that you do drink beer out of the bottle occasionally. You know? Now, please, I'm not meaning that you should vulgarize yourself. Just as a professor should come down there and, you know, scratch his stomach with the students. I'm not suggesting that. But I think you have to meet the student who scratches his stomach and go from there. If you start by quoting Plato, all you do is shut him off, you see. I think this is what I'm suggesting at that level. Will you be secure enough in your own sense of identity that you can afford to get down there and talk to the guy who architecturally is scratching his stomach with a 2x4? I think that's... Well, sir, I thank you.
sold him a bill of goods. No comment. Thank you.
Thank you.